All right, it looks like we're now live with this next hangout, the philosophy pop-up series. This month, as I think everybody should know, it is Stoic Week and Stoicon and Stoicon X's. So, I had to do something on Stoicism, so I put a poll up for my Patreon supporters and then open it up to other people to see what they wanted me to talk about. And Stoicism and emotions got pretty close to winning, but Stoicism and the dichotomy of control, a perennial issue always being talked about, came up and won instead. So I'm actually going to put a little pitch here about my Patreon supporters. And if you're interested in contributing to that. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the dichotomy of control. And it's something that we see mostly coming out of Epictetus's text. I'll tell you exactly where in just a moment. I'm just doing a few linking things right now very quickly so I can have everything set up as we want it. I got to get into the thing so I can actually see your comments. Yeah, I got to get into that live control thing. So while I'm waiting on that, while I'm figuring out how to get myself back to that control room, and see the comments that you've got, let's talk about the dichotomy of control. It's very straightforward. It's talking about the things that are in our control or in our power, or if you want another translation of it, our business, those things that are up to us, epumon in the Greek, and those things that are not, those things that are outside of our control, that have to do with other people, that you could say other people, fate, processes, all these sorts of things. And Epictetus tells us about this in Untitled Chapter 1, and in the very first chapter of the very first book of the Discourses, which is entitled "Those Things That Are in Our Control." I think a lot of people only look at Untitled 1, and so they end up getting a somewhat distorted picture of what's going on. What you want to do is you actually want to look at these references to what's in our control, what's not in our control throughout the rest of the Enchiridion, but also in Epictetus's discourses and in other places too. And the other Stoics don't talk quite so much about this. They talk about other related things, but I think you can read it into Seneca or read it into Marcus Aurelius or other people as well. So let's start by talking about what he thinks is actually in our control. So if you've read Enchiridion 1, you know that he says that what's in our control are our desires and aversions, our opinions or judgments, and our choices, or sometimes it's translated impulse, horme in Greek. And then a little bit later in that, he's going to talk about other things that are also within the scope of our control as well. But what's not in our control? This is what throws a lot of people. And this is, I think, what led somebody like William Irvine in his book on Stoicism, Guide to the Happy Life, to try to substitute a trichotomy of control. I know this is a very controversial topic that many people get very worked up about. Myself, I don't think that there's anything really intrinsically bad about positing a trichotomy. It just turns out that I think that the trichotomy is already dealt with, the way that Irvine is articulating it, dealt with adequately in Epictetus in his work. So Epictetus says that our body is not something that is in our control. That's a bit paradoxical, right? And we'll talk about why in just a moment. He says, wealth, property, finances, those sorts of things are not in our control. He says that reputation, doxa, that's not in our control. Powers, being assigned positions of responsibility, that's not in our control. And there's a lot of other things that he'll talk about as well. In Enchiridion 1, the main upshot of that is to tell us, look, if you can't make this distinction between what's really in your control and what you might think is in your control but isn't in your control, you're going to be unhappy. if you concentrate on the things that really are up to you, that really are your business, you're going to be a much happier, freer, tranquil person. If you're tying yourself in, if as we say, you emotionally invest yourself in these other things that aren't really in our control, like what other people think, or how our body, looks day after day, or how much money we've got in our accounts and what we can buy with it, or whether we get the promotion at work or not. If that's where you, to use a non-Epictetean phrase, but that's where you place your treasure, you're laying yourself in for a lot of heartache, because it might go all right for a little while, but then pretty soon you're going to run into obstacles, and you're going to be, to use a favorite word of his, hindered. You can't be hindered in the things that really are yours, but you can be hindered in things that belong to somebody else, or to, you might say, the universe, or to random processes or things like that. So I want to come back in a bit to talking about, like, how could the body not be in our control? What does he mean by that? But first I want to talk about something else that's really important, and that is the use of external things. So you could say internals are in our control, externals not in our control, right? Epictetus says that, yeah, those outside things, those indifferents, like, for example, my iPhone here, piece of property, an incredibly powerful computer device that I use to run, many aspects of my life and my business, not really in my control. I mean, Apple shows me that every time that they want to do an update and I can't use my phone for a little while, or it starts slowing down because they've changed the software, and we can go on and on and on and on, right? And the battery can drain very quickly. There's all sorts of things that just demonstrate to you over and over again that this piece of property that's so important to us is not in our control. My use of it, my dealing with it, in Greek, chresis. I'm actually going to write this down for people because I think they may find this interesting. This is the sort of Romanized way of doing it. I'm not going to try to use Greek characters. But chresis means dealing with or use, how it is that we comport ourselves with something. That is in our control. That is not something indifferent, according to the Stoics. That has an impact. So swinging back now to the body, right? I don't ultimately control my body. There are all these processes going on. My body is a sort of locus of vulnerability to the world for me. I can walk out of my apartment and get hit by the bus. Now, that doesn't mean I shouldn't look both ways before crossing the street, but I could look both ways and be a little bit distracted, and a Prius could take me out, right? Because you can't hear them coming when they're on their hybrid thing, or all sorts of other things. We can imagine comic book, cartoon stuff. A safe falls down and hits me on the head. Diseases, endemics. We are now at the stage where we thought we had total control over disease, and we're giving everybody antibiotics, and lo and behold, the bacteria have evolved resistance to them, and now we have these terrible infections that are very difficult to deal with, and anybody could get them, right? And I can work out, I can do all the things that I ought to do with my body. Epictetus is really clear. He uses all these working out metaphors. You probably should work out your body. He also thinks you should do basic hygiene, keep your body clean. There's an entire chapter on that, and I think it's in book 3 or book 4 of the Discourses, right? But you can do all that, and your body can still be not what it is that you want. The older that you get, the more you see about that. For instance, I mean, if I really wanted to be, if I was pretty vain, I might, dye my beard and my mustache, which you notice are basically 2 different colors, right? My mustache is all this brown and then white in it. My beard has all this just plain white in it. You look at some pictures of me 5 years ago, it was all, brown and black. I can dye it. I don't have any control over how the hair grows in, Same thing with, I need to wear these glasses. I do have control over whether I put them on or not, but I don't change, the way my eyes are. I suppose I could go and do LASIK, right? But we can go on and on and on with examples like this. The basic idea is that, there are so many things that we control the use of it, but we don't control the outcome. Like the trichotomy that Irvine was proposing, in saying that we internalize our goals and we play tennis, we play to the best of our ability, but we don't control whether we win the match. That's exactly what Epictetus was saying. Only he didn't see a need to posit a trichotomy. He thought that fit into a dichotomy of control. The other thing that I do want to bring up in terms of the dichotomy of control that I know a lot of people express concerns about, Epictetus on the other side, right? What is in our control? So our thoughts, our choices, our desires, and our aversions, whether we give assent to things or not, all of these sorts of things, Epictetus says, are in our control. And that might lead you to the idea that he thinks that they are directly in our control and that we never encounter kind of opposition within, which is totally not the case. This is why Epictetus emphasizes the role, and the Stoics in general did, the role of habit. When we've already created habits of approaching things in a certain way, it's almost like they work on autopilot, and we have to do a lot to catch ourselves, even just to notice that we've got a habit, first of all, and then to slowly wean ourselves away from that and eventually to substitute a different habit. That does not happen overnight. And so, Epictetus talks about, for example, anger. If you're an angry person and you manage to go a couple days without getting angry, that's good. If you go 30 days, he says, that's amazing, sacrifice to God, and you've probably managed to establish a new habit. I've never gone more than a week without losing my temper, right? And I'm working on this sort of stuff. And I think all of us can relate to this in one way or another. There are going to be some things that are internal, but seem to us to be much less in our control. Epictetus isn't saying that you automatically can snap your fingers and then suddenly, if you've fallen in love with somebody, but you realize that they're bad for you, you're not going to just like switch a switch in your brain and suddenly everything is great and you don't have any desire for that person, right? Or if you have a phobia, a kind of aversion towards something, you're not going to just suddenly wake up one day and not be worried about, I don't know, closed spaces or spiders or public speaking or any of those sorts of things. It takes work, and that's something that he recognizes. So it's important to keep that in perspective. Let me look at now at the control panel and see what we got. Oh, there's quite a few questions already. So I'm going to give priority to questions that are actually about the Stoics and things like that. Actually, I'll address something at the start. I should do a stream with the partially examined life. I actually did a stream with the partially examined life a long time ago on Nietzsche. They brought me in because they needed somebody who's got a background in Nietzsche, and they never called me back again. So if you want me on the partially examined life, I would hector them until they want to bring me back on. I have written on their blog, so clearly they're interested in that, and they're actually just down the road. The guy who runs it is based in Madison. So if you want to see me on it more, I think send them an email. Here's another one from Robert Woolston. Did the ancient Stoics or Epicureans make a distinction between the proper balance of focusing on virtue and ethics and acquiring material possessions or social concerns like reputation? Yeah, the proper balance for the Stoics is that virtue gets the highest priority. But you certainly can devote yourself to making a living and to maintaining your reputation. This is where the Stoics differed from like the Cynics, for example. And you place it into a proper perspective. I'd say if you want to see that at work, take a look at what Epictetus is saying in the discourses. Take a look at Cicero's works where he presents that, and also another author who's not all that widely read but talks quite a bit about this is Arius Didymus in his Epitome of Stoic Ethics. Epicureans, yes, they also did that as well. They focused mostly on how this would impact our pleasures and pains because that's central for them. Unfortunately, we don't have very much Epicurean literature from the ancient period. We even don't really have that much of what the Stoics wrote, so that's too bad. I want to give a shout out to my son who is watching right now. He just texted me to tell me, so that's really cool. He is a budding YouTuber and may have an interest in someday becoming a philosopher. I don't know if in academic sense, but he and I talk about these things as I do with other members of my family. But I just thought that's really cool that he is watching. So, all right. Let's see why. Okay, I'm going to skip over the art thing and maybe come back to that. Let's see if we can get to some Stoic stuff. Oh, here's a good one. The dichotomy seems to relate to conceptions of free will. The Stoics are often portrayed as having a compatibilist viewpoint. Do you think this is accurate, or are there important nuances there? So there's a lot to be said about that. First of all, the notion of free will is an ambiguous notion. So when somebody starts saying, oh, there is no such thing as free will, or neuroscience this, or determinism that, I always want to say, well, what do you actually mean by free will? Because not everybody has the same conception. And so a lot of the times people are disproving free will over here, but it's not what other people mean by it. That said, the Stoics themselves did not develop a robust conception of free will as such. Epictetus talks about the proairesis, which is the faculty of choice, which is almost the will, if we look at what, say, Augustine means by the will, but it's not exactly the same thing. So, you got to be a little bit careful with that. I see somebody saying, oh, can we abandon this free will issue, silly issue? No, it's not a silly issue. As a matter of fact, I think it's so important I've written articles on it. And so it may seem silly to you, but it's not silly. And there's good reasons why people have talked about that. So this issue of compatibilism, let's say we get away from the word free will and we talk in terms about freedom of choice. And we think about whether we have any freedom to make things go one way or the other, or whether we're just driven by some outside forces or internal programming or something like that. Then we get away from some of the emotional worries that I think people have about that term. And maybe get away from some of the baggage that holds people back. And the Stoics then, yes, are compatibilists. They do, in fact, think that everything is ultimately part of one large interlocking causal process. And yet, at the same time, there are free causes. I mean, Aristotle also has the same sort of thing. Self-moved movers, part of this gigantic, interesting system. And if you want to see a really great work talking about this, although unfortunately it's fragmentary because we've lost parts of the text, read Cicero's On Fate. He summarizes what some of the ancients had to think about this issue. And he talks about the Epicurean position, a couple other positions. The Epicureans had this famous swerve. And when you see people appealing to like quantum mechanics today, they're in essence doing the same sort of argument that Epicurus and the Epicureans were, that Cicero found very unconvincing. It's an issue that's going to run all the way down to the present. Many of the other people that I do a lot of work on, like the Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, discuss it. Sartre also points out that most of the ways in which philosophers have been discussing it is rather artificial. So that's probably enough about that at that point. And just to respond, why do you think we should care about free will? Just curious. Hey, if you don't care about it, don't care about it. The rest of us do, Nobody's going to push it on you, I think. So you have to worry about it. So let's go back to some of the other things. Here's a good question. What is the best Stoic to begin with? I get asked this quite often. I will admit that I am a big fan of Epictetus. I really do like, Marcus Aurelius. I really do like Seneca. Musonius Rufus is interesting, although we don't have that much of him. Arius Didymus is pretty cool too. But I don't know, I guess you could say my heart belongs to Epictetus. There's something about him and his approach that I really enjoy. And it could be a function of the guy who wrote his stuff down, Arius, this historian who modeled himself, by the way, after Xenophon, student of Socrates, also a military commander and historian and chronicler of his great teacher. So there's kind of an interesting historical precedent. And I think that a lot of people get introduced to Stoicism through one of three main sources when they're talking about, classic sources. I know a lot of people get introduced to Stoicism through reading, more contemporary works, whether they be, really solid ones, or in some sense very academic works, or whether they're much more popularly oriented. I think it's really important to go back to the primary sources. If you're only getting Stoicism from reading secondary contemporary literature or watching videos or listening to podcasts, you're not really getting it from the source, and I think you're depriving yourself of something important. So Seneca's Letters is a big one. Epictetus' Enchiridion, and then of course Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So you can certainly read the Meditations. They're great. You can certainly read Seneca's Letters. That's kind of long, but the Enchiridion is nice and short. It's also not all that. It's not as representative of Epictetus when you read the discourses. So in a way, it offers a kind of interesting launching point, because people can read it and be like, what the hell? What's he talking about here, right? And then you can say, well, here's the fuller doctrine in the discourses. And sometimes that kind of intellectual contact is very good. Let's see here. I like how Epictetus describes how we control our own desires, but if our desires were in another body, we'd have no interest in them. This is from An Ordered Whole. That's an interesting idea. I mean, who does that ever happen to? It's kind of we're in the realm of thought experiments, several degrees removed from reality at that point. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I don't really have something interesting or intelligent to say about that kind of thought experiment at that point. Playlist writes, do you have any recommendations on how to retain information to one's highest potential? Is it something that largely comes naturally, or would you recommend Feynman lectures? Shout out to your son. I wouldn't recommend Feynman lectures because I don't watch them, so I can't recommend them. I don't know if they're good or bad. How to retain information to one's highest potential. I don't really have much to say about that, because I was always kind of in a weird boat because I remembered an awful lot of stuff. I do often not remember things that I should remember that are a bit more like mundane. And I don't have such great control over what I do remember and don't remember unless I actively work to put things to memory. I mean, when it comes to like the history of philosophy, there's nothing like actually wading your way through the text time and time again. I'll tell you kind of an interesting story. One of the reasons why, besides just doing wide reading and having a real interest in what I was reading, one of the reasons why I know the history of philosophy so well is because of something that we had to do in graduate school, which unfortunately my graduate school, like many others, has since abandoned as a practice for graduate students. It was what was called preliminary examinations. And that was at the PhD level. You also had to take a comprehensive examination at the master's level. And these were tests. You get 3.5 hours. You had to answer questions, essay questions, out of a pool, right? So the comps, you had 3 questions in ancient, 3 questions in medieval, 3 questions in modern, 3 questions in 19th century philosophy. And if you couldn't answer any of the 3, you were screwed. You failed, right? And so you would pick one of them, and then you would have to answer it. And I actually got a low pass on my comps, in part because I wrote, in a very Ciceronian style. One of the complaints was your first paragraph was 16, or your first sentence was 16 lines long on a blue book paper. And I was like, well, who cares? Did I get it right or not? But it was that sort of stuff. And so for the prelims, you had a much wider reading list. We had to do one prelim on metaphysics and philosophy of religion, one on epistemology and philosophy of science, one on value fields, which was aesthetics, politics, ethics, and then one on your special thinker. And I chose Hegel for my special thinker. And when I said, well, what do I need to study for the Hegel exam? The professor in charge said, just memorize the phenomenology, the basic structure of it. So I did. I actually did that. He said, oh, by the way, there'll be some stuff on the science of logic as well. So I went through that and paid close attention to that as well. But for the other things, like think about the metaphysics, right? You got this reading list, and it was incredibly long, and your questions that you might get asked could be anything from that reading list. So it could be anything from Plato's dialogues to Stoic stuff, to Descartes' meditations and what's going on in there, to 20th century stuff. It was from history of philosophy, some analytic writers, some continental writers, some classical American writers. And so there were two ways to go about this. You could try to game it and hope that you might get questions that actually answered to the things that you'd studied. Or you could do what I did, and what some of my other colleagues that I've talked about this did, and read it all and learn it all, and somehow keep all of that in your head for a while. Now, I can't say that I actually have retained all of that, right? But I've retained a good bit of it. And when I got thrown into my first teaching situation, where I had to teach a whole bunch of different classes, I knew a lot of these thinkers at a sufficient level to be able to communicate them to somebody else. I'll mention, and just in case he's watching, somebody who is a very strong proponent of continuing to keep these, Tom Alexander, one of the professors at Southern Illinois University. He made a good argument for why they should be kept, and unfortunately they weren't. And I think that it's kind of an academic hazing, but it really was good for us that went through it and did it the right way. That's a little bit of a long discussion of that. All right, here's a great question that I think I may have skipped over. What about people who are mentally ill? Do they really have control over their attitude and thoughts? So when you put it like that, the answer is yes and no. They do have control over some of their thoughts, right? They may not have control over all of their thoughts. So think about somebody with a terrible phobia. Now the question is, do they have control over their thoughts at the time that they're experiencing things, or does that mean that they never have control over those thoughts, that they can't work at it in some way? And there are some varieties of what we classify as mental illness, and actually, going back to ancient philosophy, they talked about mental disease as well, but they thought philosophy could be useful in working at it. And this is what we in fact find. There are therapeutic approaches that draw heavily on Stoicism. The whole cognitive approach. Originally, a good bit of that is coming out of Stoicism. If you're interested in positive psychology, well, I think Seligman gets Aristotle wrong, but read some Aristotle. If you're interested in the emotional intelligence approach, which is much less about mental illness and much more about other things, that begins with a quote by Aristotle. So ancient philosophy does have some hooks for that, but there will be some things that are not as amenable to applying Stoic philosophy as a therapy, but that doesn't mean that you can't do anything with it. I think we really got to avoid this on-off, black-white thinking about that. We want to make distinctions. This is something very important in philosophy and in life in general. Being able to do something isn't the same thing as being able to do nothing, but it's not the same thing as having absolute total control, right? And so we want to think our way through this. There's a lot of things that we classify as mental illnesses or as disorders that are, to some degree tractable from using philosophical resources and tools. It can get to the point where, if your brain chemistry is really screwed up, you can, tell yourself as much as you like, but that's not going to actually help you. In that case, sometimes medication is the answer. And for many people, altering the brain chemistry and working on oneself, these can go hand in hand. So That's pretty important. Let's see here. I gotta scroll up a bit because it suddenly jumped. Oh, great question from Natasha. How can we make the dichotomy of control a regular Stoic practice? So that is that's really at the core of how to put this stuff into play. One way is to remind oneself of it in situations where it applies, right? So something goes wrong and you ask yourself, wait a second, is this something that's in my control? Is it something that's not in my control? If it's not in my control, then I'm not really being harmed by it. And maybe I shouldn't be so emotionally invested in it. I know I feel bad right now, but maybe I should, adopt a different perspective. And maybe I can only make partial success with that, right? And we can also go into situations ahead of time thinking about, well, what parts of this are in my control? What parts of this are not in my control? And you see Epictetus advocating doing exactly that in the Enchiridion. For instance, when you go to the baths, right? Like when we go to the public pool or go to the gym or go to the movie theater, say to yourself, what am I going here to do? To keep my faculty of choice in accordance with nature. Maybe don't express it to yourself like that because that's a little abstract. Path. I want to keep my cool, right? And then think to yourself, well, I am going to the movie theater, hopefully getting to see the movie without people acting like jackasses around me. But if they do, and I say something and they still act like jackasses, I don't really have control over that. So I don't have to let that interfere with that. He talks about people splashing you at the baths and stealing your stuff. I think that happens at the public pool, right? And then people playing their music too loud. And we could go on and on and on and on with examples like this. You're on your commute to work and you think about the coworkers or your boss or your customers that you're going to have to deal with. Some of them are a treat, some of them aren't. Right? You can think about what's in your control and what's not in your control. So the Stoics actually suggest having ready to hand sort of sayings, dogmata about these sorts of things. All right, let me take a few more here on free will. From Marcos, is free will more connected with atheists? A lot of people say God willing, so is there a contrast to be made? No, free will isn't more connected with atheists. Most of the great world religious traditions say that human beings do have free will. There's often some sort of story that has to be told about how this can be compatible with divine foreknowledge or stuff like that. And they're not simple stories, but they're interesting stories. So I don't see it as necessarily connected with atheism. Saying God willing or fate willing or anything like that is just sort of, the Stoics call that this reserve clause, right? Things could go my way. They could satisfy my desires or maybe not, right? So here's a one from playlist. Isn't free will largely limiting due to the disposition we find ourselves in, or do you take this into account when illustrating your ideas? Is free will a choice of a built-up library of things we know? I'm not really quite sure how to respond to that, but I think, so I'm going to interpret that as, isn't free will itself largely limited due to the disposition we find ourselves in? Yeah. Nobody says that free will means that you can do anything whatsoever at any time, choose anything possible. There's always some conditioning going on, right? And I think this is where a lot of people get mixed up. They're like, yeah, if you believe in free will, you think that like you can do anything. No, you can choose sometimes just between very, very narrow options, right? Or you can adopt this tiny little bit of freedom, but it's still some freedom. And that's all we need to have in order to say that there is some freedom of choice. Let's scroll down. Yeah, X writes, discourses shed so much more light into the Enchiridian's methodology. Well, the Enchiridion is a best hits list pulled out of the discourses. Not just the 4 books that we possess, but the 4 lost books that we unfortunately don't have. And again, Stoic literature, there's so much stuff that it would be so cool if we had it. And you never know, they might discover some scroll somewhere and unroll it, and here's, Zeno's On Choice, or Zeno's Republic, or one of Chrysippus's many writings, or works by Panaetius, or even some of the ones that we hardly ever talk about, like, Diogenes of Babylon, or Antipater, or, these other interesting guys. But that's not probably going to happen. So, if you really want to know Epictetus, you want to go to the discourses. And I think they're well worth spending the time with. All right. Ordered Whole has a question about Stoic physics and its connection with ethics. What do you think about the Stoic assumption of a universal natural logos and a dichotomy of control? So this is a good question, because this is something where I think a lot of modern Stoics, and modern Stoic is a broad term, right? And we're kind of in the middle of an interesting set of debates and discussions about precisely what it entails and encompasses. By the way, a plug, we just talked about that with an online symposium in Stoicism today, earlier, with 7 people weighing in, and then John Sellers and I had our pieces in the last week on Wednesday. So I think that you can make the Stoic ethics work without assuming the Stoic physics. I don't think that you have to buy into sort of pantheism or even the notion of providence. I think the other stuff works without that. And I think many modern Stoics don't buy into that. Traditional Stoics say, look, it's the whole thing or nothing, right? Don't call yourself a Stoic unless you actually do believe that there is like a logos permeating everything. I'm more attracted to the modern Stoic perspective, insofar as I am any sort of Stoic, because I'm actually more of an eclectic than a Stoic. But yeah. So, here's a good one from Marcos. In your courses, do you use primary sources exclusively, or are secondary texts useful? Secondary texts are useful. Never get to them because there's not enough time, right? If I'm teaching an ethics class, I've had to already cut out, a good 30 texts that I would like to teach in there, primary texts that we're not going to get to. So we're going to stick just in the class time that we have with primary texts. And if people want to read secondary texts, that's fine. I even give them the equivalent of that with lesson pages and videos and stuff like that, because everything I do is essentially secondary literature, right? But I think it's important to engage primary texts that, especially if we're thinking about like traditional college education, this may be the one time that a student has the opportunity to study a classic or contemporary author with somebody who actually hopefully knows what the hell that person is saying and can explain it to them and lead them further into it. Unfortunately, not all philosophy instructors are actually up to that. We probably should have some screening and review process, but that'll never happen for the people who are teaching. So secondary literature is nice. Myself, I don't have the time to get to it unless I'm researching something. Like if I'm going to write a paper on Epictetus, there's certain people who you can bet I'm going to be bringing up. Long. Probably Sellers, right? Certainly Christopher Gill. I'm very fortunate in that by being a member of the Modern Stoicism organization, I get to chat with these guys who are these, really top-notch people. If I'm talking about Stoicism and emotion, Garver, definitely. We could go down the list, right? And it's the same thing for Aristotle, bigger group of people working on Aristotle. Who else do I typically write on? Anselm, Hobbes. Those are people where I do know the secondary lit and I stay on top of it, but that's because I'm doing academic writing as well as more public and popular stuff. That's not to say that secondary literature is bad. I mean, if you're reading a history of philosophy and it helps you kind of figure out where these people fit in relation to each other, that's good. But I think it's always important to go back to the primary texts. Black Dog, really interesting question here. Can you recommend any philosophers who are not Stoics, but they share a lot of common themes? That's a great question. So I'm going to say 2 things. One is that if you're thinking in terms of virtue ethics, there's a really great piece by Long that's responding to Alistair McIntyre's work, where McIntyre is saying that, in the contemporary setting, with virtue ethics, we really have one main, sort of, we could call it tradition to rely upon, and that's the Aristotelian tradition, mediated then through the Thomist tradition later on. And that, this would be the most robust form of virtue ethics. And there's a great argument to be made that no, Stoicism is really doing a lot of the same stuff that McIntyre was proposing and laying out. And so that, the Stoic and Aristotelian traditions could kind of support each other. That's the way I look at it. That's the way Cicero looked at it too, by the way. Big fan of Cicero. There's plenty of other thinkers and movements that are taking on some of the same issues as the Stoics. If we think about like Christian thought, or even some Jewish thought, like think about some of the non-canonical texts like Fourth Maccabees, pretty Stoic. Philo of Alexandria, well, really, anybody coming from Alexandria knows their Stoicism as well as their Platonism. So, whether it's Philo on the Jewish side or Clement on the Christian side, they're going to talk about that sort of stuff. Lactantius, another great example of somebody who takes some stuff and says, well, the Stoics seem to be right about this, wrong about that. And so these common themes come up. A lot of people want to bring together in some way or another Stoicism and what they're calling existentialism, usually meaning Sartrean existentialism, because there's a lot of varieties of existentialism. And there are a lot of common themes, right? Taking responsibility for how you respond in situations, thinking about what you have freedom in relation to and what you don't have freedom in relation to. These are very important ideas. And so I think there's a lot of interesting connections there. Let's see. Here's a good one. Jadwiga, are there any contemporary full-blown Stoics that write? Massimo Pigliucci just published a book, How to Be a Stoic, right? He's probably one of the most famous converts. Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism, which a lot of the people who are in the sort of contemporary modern Stoic movement at a high level, where they really spend a lot of time with the contemporary text, know Becker's work, which is quite good. Bill Irvine, Donald Robertson. A lot of these are people that you see in the modern Stoicism organization, right? So, we could go on and on and on. There's a lot of people writing on Stoicism. By the way, I should mention, one of the things that I had been meaning to do for a couple months, and I'm finally going to get it knocked out this month, and I'm going to do some of it this weekend, is some book reviews myself on not just Stoic, but other literature dealing with like philosophy and how to live it out in contemporary life. So you might want to watch for some of those videos. I'm also working on a book, although, like I said, I'm more of an eclectic than a Stoic. And the one that I'm currently working on, which is a detour from one of the other ones I'm supposed to be working on, has to do with this notion of in accordance with nature. And what does that mean when the Stoics are talking about that, right? Because it's an ambiguous term, and how does it apply to our lives? I'm also working on a book on Stoicism and anger as well. Let's see here. Robert writes, some people associate Stoicism as being without emotion or emotionless. For the Stoics, how do you properly deal with or control our emotions? Yeah, the Stoics, they are not emotionless. As a matter of fact, they recognize certain emotions as being good, and as even to some degree being, you might say, obligatory for us, right? We ought to feel certain ways at certain times. So, what would be examples of that? Familial affection. The Stoics think that it's natural for you to care about your kids or your parents or your siblings. And you'll see this discussed in Epictetus. You'll also see this discussed in other places. And then if you ever get your hands on Heracles, his ethics, that's, he talks about it in terms of oikeiosis. You might have come across that term. So that's an emotional state that's considered good. Marcus talks in terms of affection, love, towards other people. So does Seneca to some degree. The Stoics in general recognize that there were good emotions, but they would be emotions that are sort of within the scope of rationality. They help us to fully realize what it is to be a human being. Many of the other emotions that we feel, like, various forms of fear, anger, they were always like against anger. Jealousy, envy, hatred, these sorts of things. They thought that those were bad for us. They're bad in how they affect us. They're bad in how they make us act. Now, how do we properly deal with or control our emotions? Part of it is recognizing what's going on. So we need almost like a mechanics of how emotions work, and the Stoics did provide that. And then we got to work on it bit by bit. If I'm an angry person, I probably need not just to restrain myself from saying stupid things and doing dumb things, but also look into, well, what am I angry about? Do I have good grounds to be angry? And doing some of that work. And I think a lot of times that is, you can do that on your own. It's often good to do that with a coach or a counselor or somebody like that. And I mean, the good news is you're dealing with things that are kind of universal human conditions. So if you're struggling with anger, it's not like your anger is radically different than everybody else's. So presumably we have some guidelines for how to deal with it. Well, this is an interesting one. I think a follow-up. How should one deal with the sense that being indifferent to one's intense emotions to avoid suffering, like love, somehow depreciates or degrades its objects like it wasn't so important at all? Well, Epictetus talks about this. So in that famous passage where he says, when you kiss your wife or your child, remind yourself that they are human and they're going to die. And people are like, that's really cold. Man, I don't want to be a Stoic if that's what being a Stoic is like. And in that passage, I mean, a lot of people also respond. They're like, well, you don't really love your kid or your spouse if you have that attitude. In that very passage, it says, with things that you find useful or entertaining or towards which you feel affection, philostorgia, right? So you do feel affection, but you can with it's not withdrawing the affection. It's realizing that you're also dealing with mortal, decomposable beings that are the way that they are. So when they die, you're not as troubled. I think a lot of people think that if you're not super upset, then you never really cared at all. And the Stoics would say, is that really true? Is there a necessary connection between those? And the answer is no. There isn't. And maybe it's a delusion to think that we have to wail and throw ourselves on the coffin or something like that, or we didn't really care. Same thing with love, right? If we realize that we're madly in love with somebody, I mean, it's not like the Stoics are going to say, oh well, if you're madly in love, you have to stop that nonsense right now. But if you realize that the person is abusive or just maybe not the right person for you, you might want to resist that feeling. You might want to tell yourself that maybe your feeling is off base. So I think that's probably enough. Let's see here. Oh, I just skipped down a bunch. Looks like there's a lot of questions. Okay, Natasha has a rather technical question, which is good. Are things within our control preferred, dispreferred, or is this only externals, things outside of our control? So it's indifference that are preferred and dispreferred in general. I guess you could say that like a given thought could be preferred in that it leads you to acting virtuously, or dispreferred in that it leads you to acting unvirtuously, or viciously. But it's going to be part of a complex. Usually we talk about the things that are external and our preferred or dispreferred, like wealth, health, victory. There's like a whole list of these in Diogenes Laertes, in Cicero, and in Arius Didymus's Epitome of Stoic Ethics. So I think it's primarily going to be applying to externals. It depends on how we want to look at things like individual thoughts, individual desires, I guess. If we look at them individually, we could maybe say some of them are indifference. But I think if we look at them in their larger structure, which is where they live, right, in our minds, no, they're not going to be that way. Here's an interesting one by JP. Is Stoicism inherently conservative? Depends on what you mean by conservative. It's interesting to see Stoicism used kind of and batted all around by people from all ends of the political spectrum. There are some people who are like, Stoicism means a commitment to social justice. And by social justice, they don't mean what earlier generations meant by social justice, like what you see in John Stuart Mill or, in Catholic encyclicals on social justice, but, very contemporary hard left stuff, right? And you can, in fact, corral Stoicism in and make it do that, but I think you lose something of it in the process. Likewise, there's people on the hard right who want to try to use elements of Stoicism to do similar things, right? And they ignore the fact that, the Stoics were cosmopolitans, that they didn't think that just conservatism for its own sake was great. There's all this nonsense about, virtus is manliness. You can get a little bit of that out of Cicero, but if you read more Cicero, you'll be like, oh, I was wrong about that, right? And so people use it, and then other people try to use Stoicism basically just to make a buck, right? They'll come out with something. They'll take some business leadership theory and take a few words and then add in some Stoic quotes, and they're like, hey, buy my package, right? So people can do that. I think that if we look at authentic Stoic sources and people who are more in the mainstream, they're going to be involved with politics, but they're not going to be happy with any party that we currently have here in the United States. I don't know about in other places. And they're probably going to be fairly unpopular if they do get involved in a particular party or movement, because they're the ones who are often saying, hey guys, I realize that we're fighting the good fight, but we probably shouldn't be doing this. And everyone's like, shut up, we're fighting the good fight. That's all that matters, right? So I don't see that as inherently conservative. I think that Stoicism, if you take it seriously, I often, when people ask me, what are my political views, I tell them I don't have a single party that's congenial to me. And I'm too traditional to be conservative. And I'm not traditional in the sense that the traditionalists are. I think they're just conservatives of a different stripe. And I think Stoicism works that way too. And I think Aristotelianism works that way too, and Platonism, and a lot of these things. Here's a question from an ordered whole. Is the goal to see philosophy as a guide to happiness something we've abandoned? In academic philosophy, yeah, I would say a lot. But for those of us that read, whether we're in academics, I have one foot still in academia and one foot outside of it. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think there's a lot of institutions where they do recognize that. Think about like here, just down south in Chicago, Center for Practical Wisdom. Probably about happiness, right? There's all sorts of great institutes like that. Let me put in a plug too for one that I'm going to be doing some collaborations with these upcoming months, the New Acropolis in Chicago, where I will be giving a Stoic Week talk on Tuesday, I believe it's the 17th. So if you're in the Chicagoland area, you might want to check that out. And I'll also be giving a talk there for International Philosophy Day. They asked me if I'd come down and give a talk. And so I'm really happy to be collaborating with them. We also have a Stoic Week event, by the way, for those of you in the greater Milwaukee area, or if you're in the Chicago area and want to drive up, or if you're in Madison, want to drive over, or the Fox Cities and want to drive down. here at the Shorewood Public Library on Thursday, I believe it's the 19th. We're going to talk about Stoicism in the workplace, so some fun stuff. Let's see. Ordered Whole asks, do the skeptics have a similar dichotomy of control? Not that I know of, but that's a tradition that I don't spend that much time with, so I don't really know. Let's see if we got some more. Oh, so here's a good little terminological question from Claire. I've been listening to audiobooks on Stoicism by ancient Stoics. What does according to their deserts mean? I don't know if that's the correct spelling. So that's a good question. This is a word that we don't use in the same way anymore. It means according to what people deserve, what they merit, right? And you might think it has to do something with like the meal or the course that comes after dinner, right? Desserts. I guess you could say, well, if you're not a good person, you don't deserve dessert. Right? That could be a way to remember it. But when we talk about somebody getting their just desserts, we mean that if they're a good person, they get good things. If they're a bad person, they get bad things, right? Andy writes, you'd be surprised how often we discuss philosophy while cooking some tasty food in our house. Yes, we both share a love for the culinary arts. Andy is an amazing cook. I'm a good cook, and we do a lot of things. And I actually do some things with philosophy and food. I did a talk a while back. You can find the video on the 8 tastes, sorry. Yeah, four flavors are what we're combating. The 8 flavors in Aristotle, and then how it goes forward into, all the way up to the 19th century. Let's see here. In order to hold, is Stoicism systematic? It sure is. And anybody who tries to tell you that it's not, and you can just sort of like pick and choose whatever you like, I don't think that's real Stoicism. But that's me, right? Dash writes, what is some good entry to Seneca? The letters, I would say. He also has some treatises that are good. The On Anger is particularly useful, I think. So I would check that out. This is a funny question. So we actually have a couple that I'm going to try to answer as we come to the end. One is about me. Am I a centrist? Do you think this is the sort of niche many philosophers will eventually occupy? Yeah, but the trouble is that centrism means a lot of different things. So there's some people who are centrists just because they're like totally disconnected and couldn't care less who's in charge. There's some who are centrists because they're like, in that, we got to be totally fair to every side kind of thing. And I think that can actually be vicious sometimes. And then there's some who are centrists because they just don't belong anywhere else, and that's where I am. And are philosophers going to be there? I don't know. I wouldn't look for a hell of a lot to come from academic philosophers. They're kind of in, somebody brought up the word decadence before. I think you can say that about a lot of academic philosophy, unfortunately. It's sad to say about my profession, but there's a lot of short-sightedness, a lot of reacting out of fear or indifference to others. Christopher asks, can I talk about how Epictetus influenced Aaron Beck in the cognitive behavioral psychology? Well, it influenced Albert Ellis first, and then Ellis influenced Beck. And I don't know, if you look through the cognitive behavior psychology stuff that's still conscious of where it came from originally, or read Donald Robertson's, philosophy of CBT. That's great. He's somebody who's, very familiar with all of that stuff because he practices it, and he's a great Stoic writer. You're going to see that they drew, a lot of ideas from the Stoics, and particularly from Epictetus. So here's a funny one from Coffee Smug. What's the relation between Kant and the Stoics? Was Kant a big Stoic fanboy? I wouldn't call him a fanboy. I think there's some similarities between Kant and Stoicism, but I think there's also some really big dissimilarities. So the Stoics are eudaimonistic. They think that behaving in a way to fulfill our duties, cultivating the virtues, all of that sort of stuff, behaving in a rational fashion is going to make us happy. And Kant says happiness is not what ethics is about at all. As a matter of fact, I've got a core concept video specifically on that you might want to take a look at. And Kant, I think, has a different understanding of happiness, though. So there might be a bit of equivocation going on there. A lot of other people, like, for example, Alistair McIntyre, have thought of the Stoics as basically being sort of like proto-Kantians. I think that's a wrong approach. Here's a couple other things. Do I think modern Stoics, from Ruby, do I think modern Stoics that like memento moris are wrong in using old Roman coins, etc.? Shouldn't we use objects to remember death relevant to us today? I guess if that sort of thing helps you, if like pulling out a coin or a token or something helps you to carry out the, reminding yourself that you're mortal and everybody else is mortal, that's good. I don't need that myself, but I don't begrudge anybody else using whatever props they want. I think that, whenever we're doing, this is a little bit of a soapbox thing, whenever we're doing anything that has to do with like public philosophy, we should probably make whatever we're doing as affordable as possible for as many people to be able to enjoy it. So if somebody's making a ton of money on selling memento mori coins, that's probably not Stoic, right? Unless they're selling them in such bulk that everybody thinks they're a great thing. Is my book for sale? I'm in the Chicagoland area and assigned a copy of Reason Fulfilled by Revelation would be a nice addition to my library. Yeah, it is. You can get it on Amazon. I think if you want to like get it directly from CUA Press, you could, although I think they may charge you more. If you run into me and you've got it, I'll definitely sign it. So if you show up at the Stoic Week event, I'll be happy to do that. It's not about Stoicism, I should mention, though. It's about the Christian philosophy debates in the 1930s. I'm going to go over a little bit of time, and then we'll wrap it up. In order to hold, is the internet the cosmopolitan idea the Stoics had in mind? I do not think so. All you got to do is read through, not my comment sections, but a lot of other YouTube comment sections, and you'll be wading through a swamp of negativity. If that's what cosmopolitanism is, sort of like lowest common denominator that just keeps getting lower and lower and lower, coming from all over the world. That's not what the Stoics meant by cosmopolitanism. Same thing, I think, with a lot of what goes on Twitter or Facebook or things like that. I mean, there's great potential, right? I mean, think about what we're doing right here. This is amazing. And 30 years ago, this is only science fiction. The fact that right now I've got 70 people, probably all over the world, watching this, writing, questions that I'm answering, and it's streaming and it'll be recorded. That's amazing stuff. But if I were to do, let me put it to you this way. If this was a video about my cats, or I was doing makeup tutorials, or I was talking about in an angry way about politics or sports, or what beer I like or something like that, it wouldn't be 60, 70 viewers. It would be 1,000 viewers or 1 million viewers. So I don't know that the internet is really living up to its potential. Let's see what else we got. Ruby asks, can I talk about the Tetrapharmakos? Maybe I'll do a session specifically on Epicureanism down the line for some more philosophy pop-ups, but I'm not gonna do that right now because this is for Stoicism. Yeah, a video about cats could be philosophical. Yeah, I'd have to think about how that would happen. And if you did make it philosophical, less people would probably tune in. So I don't know what the answer to that is. So let me say thank you to everybody who showed up, asked questions, left comments. As usual, I've very much enjoyed this, and I hope that you found it good as well. And we do these every month. My Patreon supporters find out about when they're scheduled at the very beginning of the month. Everybody else, social media, I announce it the day of. I do one of these on Facebook Live and one of these on YouTube Live each month. Let me put in a plug as well. So if you don't already have tickets to Stoicon and Stoicon X Toronto, it's too late for that now, I think. Those of you who are going to be at Stoicon, come by, say hello. I'm very friendly, as you can tell. You'll have to remind me sometimes who you are, because Stoicon is such a blur. But we will be having those Stoic Week events. If you're interested in Stoicism, you definitely want to sign up, if you haven't done it already, for the Stoic Week free online course. You can find that at the Modern Stoicism website. And I think that's pretty much it. Stoicism Go this month. Not that we shouldn't practice this stuff in other months, but this is like the month, October, where it gets a lot of worldwide attention. It's a really cool class. I do it every year, even though it's kind of beginner level stuff, because it's kind of like nice to tune back up. Andy and I both do it together. It provides us with some great conversation. So if you've got a friend to do it with, or a partner, that's even better. You get to discuss what you're talking about. If there's a local event near you, we're publicizing the events on the Modern Stoicism website, so you might want to check and see whether there's anything around you, or if there's a group of people that you can participate in the Stoic Week course with. And that's all the plugs that I've got for this month. So once again, thanks to everybody, and have a great weekend.